Welcome back to our weekly philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. We have all missed you guys, so thank you very much for joining. And the topic of our talks today is very unique and with an amazing speaker, Stephen Friedman. Stephen Friedman is the New York Times acclaimed great philosopher, an artist, a scientist, and also an amazing speaker of ours. Stephen, thank you very much for joining. And we would like to give big thanks to the US Consulate General, American Space Almaty, and also you, the audience, for being with us. And please enjoy the talk. Feel free to ask your questions, give your comments. And Stephen, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Aliyah, for the introduction, as always. I, too, am grateful to be resuming the talks after our winter break. I want to thank not only yourself for moderating these and facilitating them on a weekly basis, but the Consul General in Almaty, Elmira, Dana, everybody involved in coordinating, facilitating, providing this platform for exploring philosophical issues, for exploring every type of issue, from a philosophical perspective, which is the perspective really that gives us the greatest overview, the greatest potential insight into whatever it is we're addressing. One of the things I've emphasized, and today's talk will fit within this category, philosophy deals with everything. And so more than any other human discipline, it has really critical insights and perspectives to offer on whatever the issue is. In addition, wherever one begins, with a philosophical inquiry, one can end up wherever one would like to. In other words, one can connect any particular starting point to every other position, issue, consideration, investigation. It's partly the nature of philosophy. It's partly the nature of, again, one of the features of our world that I return to on a regular basis, part of the nature of a convergent space, the space around us that we see through our conceptual eyes, our linguistic eyes, a space in which I've written an aphorism, all roads lead to Rome in a convergent space. Wherever we begin, wherever we end, we can connect to wherever we would like to. So tonight's talk is on the philosophy of simplicity. Simplicity is a central concept, a profound concept in the life of humanity, its cultural life, its scientific explorations, every aspect of its enterprises. Now, when I talk about simplicity, I don't mean something that is necessarily easy. It might be extremely hard. It might take a lifetime. It might take many lifetimes in the course of cultural efforts over generations, over centuries, to achieve a true, a just, and a deep simplification of an issue, a topic, to achieve the clarity that such simplification provides. Right? One set of relationships that summarize the philosophy that I show on a regular basis are not easy to understand necessarily, but fundamentally they represent a profound simplification of our world, our experience, in terms of heuristic space, where everything is convergent, the space that we see around us that's familiar, and epistemic space, a divergent space, the space that corresponds to the rigor of philosophical enterprise and aspiration, and the relationship between the two that we will be dealing with today. The heuristic converges to the epistemic. So again, it's not easy. It wasn't easy for me to develop those relationships, but they represent a simplification. There are lots of ways of putting that in perspective. One, I often like to, when I come up with a topic for a talk, to go in the direction or to start from whatever first strikes me, whatever first enters my mind when I consider that topic. Again, because we could begin anywhere. So might as well begin with what strikes me initially for whatever reason it does. Well, a couple of starting points, actually, to, again, put a frame around this notion of simplification. I want to mention something that the philosopher Pascal, the 17th century French philosopher, scientist, physicist, mathematician, religious thinker, considered one of the creators of the French language as we know it today. The style that Pascal pursued in his writings has a clarity and a vigor that is central to the French aesthetic about what beautiful prose is. He wrote aphoristically, largely. If you look at his most famous work, The Pensée, it's a series of short, paragraphs, effectively. Not quite as concentrated as my aphoristic writing, but concentrated nevertheless. Well, Pascal was an avid correspondent with other intellectuals of his time, of the 17th century. Once he wrote a letter to a friend and apologized at the end of the letter for not having had the time to make it shorter, not having had the time to distill it, to simplify it more to its essence. That process, again, of simplification to the extraction of the essential is one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult enterprises of artistic endeavor, intellectual endeavor, really in any direction. And to illustrate a little bit of that, I wanted to begin with some references to music, because when this topic occurred to me, one of the things that immediately came to my mind was a comment that Beethoven, composer Beethoven, had made about Handel. Beethoven is considered one of the greatest composers in the history of culture. So is Handel. Handel was the predecessor that Beethoven ended up most admiring. As a young man, Beethoven was especially drawn to the work of Mozart, felt that Mozart was the greatest composer that had lived. But in his more mature years, he more embraced Handel and Bach, considering those two in particular to be his predecessors of genius. Well, of Handel, he was especially fond. He made, on his deathbed, in fact, he told his physician, if there were a physician who could help me, his name would be called Wonderful, which is a reference to Handel's great work, great oratorio, The Messiah, that Beethoven held in especially high regard. Well, Beethoven said of Handel's work, he was able to achieve the greatest effects with the simplest of means. And that is as high a praise as Beethoven could offer. It's as high a praise as almost anyone can offer about any creator in any field. The greatest results from the simplest of means. An illustration of that is Handel's Messiah. There's the most famous section of that work is the Hallelujah Chorus. And I first saw the actual music of the Hallelujah Chorus not too many years ago. And I'm not a musician. I did when I was younger play the clarinet. I've composed a little bit, but I can read music a little bit. Okay, I mean, I understand the nature of the musical language, that I'm encountering when I see a sheet of music. Well, what struck me when I saw the first page of the Hallelujah Chorus of Handel's Messiah, again, without a deep background and exposure to the reading of scores, conducting, I've never conducted, was its simplicity. It's clear, it's manifest simplicity. One can see it even in a score, even a non-musician can see it in the score. So I'm just going to show it to you. I don't know if you have a musical background, maybe it'll make a similar impression. Just let me pull this up. And it might be a little bit hard to, I think it's probably going to be hard to see here. It is. But the point is, there are a lot of repetitious motives, simple sort of musical forms that are repeated, that become the basis of the logic and the key to the emotional impact that the work makes. Okay? So, let me play you the beginning of the Hallelujah Chorus, just so you can see what Beethoven was talking about when he said, achieving the greatest effects with the simplest of means. I will play it on my phone, and hold on one second. Just the opening, and again, these. Now, obviously, this is something that you would be able to go to online, and listen to. But again, listen for the basic repetition, the simplicity inherent in the structure. That's what Beethoven was most admiring of. Well, Beethoven himself modeled his musical compositions after that type of logic. And we see it most famously in his most famous work, his Fifth Symphony, where there's a simple motif, da-da-da-da, 3 Gs and an F, that became the symbol of victory during World War II. Well, that simple musical pattern is the basis of the entire structure of the first movement, one of the great movements, one of the great achievements in the history of music, in the history of art. And again, Beethoven is building from very simple forms. That's what he's drawn to aesthetically. That's what he admired in Handel. And that's what we ultimately admire in so much creative work, in so much intellectual work. It's central to the entire scientific enterprise, that pursuit of simplicity. But here's a little bit of, again, the most famous work, arguably, in music, in classical music, the Mona Lisa of classical music, Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, just the opening so you can see the repetitive motif that is the core of its relatively simple logic. It is repeated, it is varied, it is slightly embellished in terms of, just musical sort of components, orchestration, but still the central theme is simple and clear throughout the movement, throughout much of Beethoven's work. And it's a form of composition that had a profound influence upon the contemporary American composer, Philip Glass, who is arguably the greatest of all American composers. Certainly the one that I am most strongly drawn to. I used the concluding movement of his opera Einstein on the Beach to represent sublimity in music when I was discussing that topic, I don't know, a month or 2 months ago. Here is Philip Glass using a similar type of device, where it's a simple motive that is repeated, embellished, altered, varied, slightly, subtly, but the core is a simple logic in the way that what science imagines the core of nature to be elementary particles or fundamental forces that sort of account for all of the complexity of nature, all of the richness of nature, just through a variety of just through their amplification in different directions, their combination in different directions. So let me play you the concluding movement of an opera by Philip Glass, just so you can see the same device at work. Oh, and here, let me show you an image. I think I've shown you this in the past. An image of some of these people I'm talking about. Here is Handel, a 17th century composer. Here is Beethoven, is again arguably the most famous of all composers, and so his image is fairly well known. That's a painting of him. And here is Philip Glass, the contemporary American composer. Now, let me just play you a little bit. Now, one of the interesting convergences between Handel and Philip Glass, aside from the use of repetitive motifs to achieve a strong effect, is their final movements are typically the most compelling of their entire work. So it's as if the work is moving towards the distillation and often the simplification of forms that the final movement presents. Well, here is the opening of the final movement of the Philip Glass opera. Again, you can hear the repetitious forms that are varied. They're endlessly varied, but the core is identifiable and binds the work together in a clear logic. Well, finally, I wanted to say something about Mozart, the composer that I tend to embrace the most. There is a musicologist, Alfred Einstein, that I read when I was young. I was in high school. He, at the time, was one of the most celebrated writers and analysts of Mozart's, life and musical achievement. And actually, before I tell you the story about Alfred Einstein, let me say something about my introduction to Mozart's operas, which is the focus of what I want to illustrate about Mozart's commitment to simplicity, distillation, simplification in his art. And Mozart, again, is another individual who ranks as among the greatest creative spirits in the history of human culture. When I was in high school, the Hollywood Bowl, it's a famous concert setting, an outdoor amphitheater in Los Angeles, for a period of time hosted every Wednesday night what were called musical marathons, devoted to a particular classical composer or period of classical music creation. So, for example, there would be a Baroque night. There would be a night devoted to Beethoven's work or Mozart's, or a night devoted to Renaissance music or Romantic, compositions. Well, they were these marathons would go on. The admission charge was minimal, and the marathons would extend for 5, 6, 7 hours and more, so that one was hearing an enormous quantity of work that one could compare and get a sense of relative value, relative worth. I remember I went to the Baroque concert, and for two or 3 hours was moderately involved, moderately engaged, until finally some pieces, some madrigals by Monteverdi were performed. And the contrast, between the musical contrast in terms of the sublimity of what Monteverdi had achieved compared to what I had listened to in the 2 or 3 hours prior to that, was stark, was clear, was unmistakable. And so from that point forward, I appreciated Monteverdi from that experience. Well, I attended a musical marathon devoted to Mozart's music. All of these were conducted and narrated effectively by Lucas Foss, a prominent conductor and composer of the time. The first few hours of the Mozart night were devoted to instrumental music. And then, as the last hour approached, Lucas Foss comes out on stage and says, "Now we turn to Mozart's operas." And this is the most important section of the evening, because Mozart was the Shakespeare of opera. Well, I think you know from these talks how I regard Shakespeare, that Shakespeare is the greatest writer in English, arguably the greatest writer in any language. In any case, I help give conduct some discussion sections with a class of Kazakhstani students who are learning English on a weekly basis. And I tell them that the main reason, the most important reason to learn English is to be able to read Shakespeare. And my sense of Mozart is just that. In fact, it's been said that Mozart's understanding of women as represented in his music is even greater than that of Shakespeare's. So as a dramatist, as a musical dramatist, Mozart is unmatched in the history of music. Well, Mozart's final major work is The Magic Flute, a work that when I was in college, I would listen to on recordings weekly, twice weekly, sometimes 3 times weekly. It was a work that I was obsessed with. It is probably his most spiritually aspirational of his achievements. Well, so now we're talking about, in the case of Mozart, one of the greatest creators, of any medium in human history. We're talking about the arena of his work in opera, which is supreme among Mozart's achievement. And we're talking about now the Magic Flute, one of his consummate achievements, and Alfred Einstein in particular focused upon the finale, the concluding section of the Magic Flute, of which he said, "Mozart brought into play every musical means at his disposal, but in the end decreed simplicity, extreme simplicity. Now, think of that for a second. Mozart bringing into play every musical means at his disposal when Mozart arguably had more musical means at his disposal than anyone who has ever lived, and decreeing simplicity, extreme simplicity. It's been said that Mozart's career as a composer represents a successive process of distillation, that he's moving towards a fundamental simplification of expression to achieve an essential communication, an essential embodiment, in musical terms. Well, that applies to the work of many people. That applies to the work of cultures moving towards a clarity of representation in almost every field. So I just wanted to play you a little bit from the finale of Mozart's The Magic Flute, just so you can see again what Alfred Einstein had in mind when he made that comment about Mozart's decreeing extreme simplicity despite having every musical means at his disposal. And it's... And again, that's from the finale of The Magic Flute. Well, I just want to illustrate that at the highest reaches of musical art, the work of Handel, the composer that Beethoven admired above all others, the work of Beethoven, the work of Philip Glass, the great American composer, the work of Mozart, at its highest, simplicity and simplification is operating to control the logic and guide the form and the achievement. It, again, is operating philosophically in forms like this. When I was doing my play in New York, Phalaris's Bull, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World, that I've mentioned, that has been made available actually for viewing in, I think in relation to World Philosophy Day through the American Spaces. Well, now I am not an actor, right? Doing this work in New York was an alien experience to me. I had had no previous experience on the stage except when I was in the 5th grade and did a tableau, a frozen painting, where I was dressed as Sir Francis Drake, holding a sword. There were no lines. That was the only previous time that I was ever on a stage. Okay. Well, suddenly, on a stage in New York City, performing a one-man show, a one-person show for an hour and a half, right? Which was, again, not my métier, not my normal, comfortable world or environment to work within. Well, but the director, in order to help, I think, inspire my performance, said to me one day, you need to fully appreciate, what's being offered here, what the play is offering to people. That within its lines, within its development, within its content, you're starting from very simple principles, very simple philosophical ideas, like the past can't guarantee the future decides the past. Any two things are approximately the same in heuristic space, but rigorously different. We suffer within heuristic space. We achieve the forms that religions perceive, imagine as embodying complete solutions to human life within epistemic space, within its rigors. Well, he says, starting from those really elemental ideas, 2 is not equal to 1, you're able to solve a whole range of human problems. In a sense, all human problems. That's an illustration of this process of distilling, simplifying to achieve results that then have the power to ramify, to affect, to apply to every circumstance, every occasion. Simplification is something that was central to the aesthetic, the sense of beauty of Michelangelo. Before I talk about Michelangelo, I wanted to mention the American philosopher, Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau is an early 19th century American philosopher and writer and naturalist. He is most famous for his work, Walden, which I think I have talked about. He was relatively unknown in his lifetime, but has become a major spiritual presence and force, a leader of what's called the transcendentalist movement in American philosophy. One of the things about Thoreau that I like to mention is he was a student at Harvard. When he was at Harvard, he lived in a building on Harvard Yard called Hollis Hall. Okay, he lived in Hollis 11. These buildings at Harvard, they go back centuries, right? Some of them housed revolutionary troops, American revolutionary troops. That was true of Hollis Hall. And I just want to show you a picture of Hollis Hall. Let's see, this is not something I sent Aaliyah, it's something I found since. Here is Hollis Hall, I think you can see that. That's an actual photograph, though it looks like a painting. That's Hollis Hall. Now, if you'll notice, there are 2 entrances. I can't show you this that easily. I did send it to Aaliyah. Okay. I don't know the entrance on the left, okay? There are 2 entrances. There's an entrance on the left. There's an entrance on the right. It turns out that I lived in Hollis Hall when I was a freshman at Harvard. I went in the entrance on the left, and I went up 3 levels, and I was in Hollis 12 across the hall from where Thoreau had lived as an undergraduate 150 years earlier. Okay, so I feel a certain connection to Thoreau in that way, but obviously much more seriously and profoundly in terms of his philosophical writings. One of the things that Thoreau stressed, in fact, he said it and he repeated it as an anthem: simplify, simplify, simplify. Now, he was living in a time when the Industrial Revolution was gaining steam. He saw the complexities, the emerging complexities of human life as sort of taking us away from ourselves, from a fundamental sense, knowledge of ourselves and our circumstances in the world, in nature, saw them as a distraction. So his urge to simplify was directive towards our lifestyle and towards away from the industrialization that was taking over the modern world. That industrialization, the next century, would manifest itself in consumerism and the focus upon accumulating things. There's an American poet and critic, Randall Jarrell, who wrote a famous article called A Sad Heart at the Supermarket, where he talks about this obsession with stuff, with things. Obviously, that was an impulse that Thoreau found himself positioned away from and against. But this impulse of simplification is, again, it's an aesthetic. One can sort of use it to guide one's choices in life. You see, my environment is essentially simplified. I don't have a lot of things. I used to have furniture. I prefer having space to furniture. Le Corbusier, the great 20th century French architect, had a similar aesthetic. He liked space. Well, it's again, it's something that has an aesthetic value in terms of our life choices, but it's also fundamental in our artistic, creative, intellectual choices, right? This impulse to simplify. And I want to show how it manifests itself in the work of another supreme artist, Michelangelo. We talked about Michelangelo in relation to sublimity. Again, a couple of months ago, I showed Michelangelo's David in contrast to his predecessor Donatello's David. Donatello's David is kind of fussy, so a lot of detail. Michelangelo's is more lean and simplified. That is, again, a key to Michelangelo's aesthetic. I know in his later work, it seems to become complex. He's one of the creators of the style of mannerism. But simplicity is a relative notion, right? But what's important is Michelangelo's express definition of beauty, which is the purgation, the elimination of superfluity, of what is unnecessary. So again, an impulse to simplify. And in the case of Michelangelo's David, here's Thoreau, okay? In the case of Michelangelo's David, you can see the David on the left, you can see Donatello's on the right. You see the Michelangelo's David is a much more elemental type of vision, construction. Its power is owing to that elemental form that Michelangelo is embracing. We see this focus on the elemental throughout the history of art. It is something that I think is most famously displayed in the work of the great 20th century American artist, maybe the greatest of all American painters, visual artists, Andy Warhol, someone who I admired enormously earlier in my artistic development and still have high regard for his achievement. Now, Andy Warhol was influenced by advertising. He had worked within advertising. And one of the things about advertising is the images have to be clear, have to be strong, have to be able to communicate directly and emphatically. And that requires enormous distillation. That is, again, the product of an extraordinary effort of simplification. And here, here's Andy Warhol. You can see him in the mirror on the left, and there he is in actuality on the right in this photograph, famous for his blonde hair or bleached hair. And here is a work of his. It's Liza Minelli, a prominent American performer, singer, actor. It's the work of Andy Warhol's. Again, you can see the simplification of the form. You can see how strong and clear, like the line, the image is. That is a lot of Andy Warhol's sort of enduring presence, place in American art, in world art, is due to the strong, clear, simplified images he achieves. It takes a lifetime to distill work to that level, as it does in sciences. Okay, and I want to give a few examples of science, and then I want to go into the philosophical ground of justification, of this impulse towards simplicity and simplification. Well, a good place to start is always Einstein, right? As admired a figure in the history of science as one can point to. Einstein himself displayed an impulse towards simplicity. His theory of relativity is based upon two postulates, in the same way that my work is based upon very simple notions of epistemic and heuristic space. They may be complicated in some way, but they're simple in others, a divergent space, a convergent space. In the same way, Einstein's work begins with two basic propositions, that the laws of physics are the same no matter what your state of motion is. So you cannot do an experiment to determine that you are definitively at rest or in motion. And secondly, that the speed of light is a universal constant. Starting from those two propositions, Einstein achieves a revolution in the history of science, in the history of physics. And one of the results of those two postulates, if you like, those two assumptions that Einstein made, is the famous equation E equals mc squared, which gives the relationship between two of the fundamental quantities in physics, in the world, energy and mass. And it's a simple relationship. E equals mc squared. Now, coming up with it was not simple. Coming up with it was a matter of entertaining a certain simplified form of a final or definitive solution to a certain type of problem. But, when you read the paper that Einstein wrote, presenting E equals mc squared to the world in 1905, the logic of the paper is not rigorous. Well, we know it's not going to be rigorous because only philosophy achieves a limiting rigor. Science is operating at a level of development, argument, representation that is below that level of rigor because, again, for a simple reason, the world is different in different directions. Therefore, it's impossible to control an experiment perfectly, no matter what one attempts. Well, but Einstein, in developing the paper and in moving towards that relationship, almost saw it as a beautiful, simplified form of representation. And he was drawn to it partly for the aesthetics of it. Obviously, it's later been validated, but still, it's a beautiful relationship. It's a simple relationship. E, energy, equals m, mass, times c, the velocity of light squared. And it's the relationship that Einstein was most proud of and thought was his crowning achievement, his greatest achievement. So, but a simplified result, not something that you can look at and be dazed by the complexity of the form. No, it's a simple form. And that's central to its power. One can make really the argument that every scientific theory, every major scientific result is achieving some level of simplification. That's the ultimate impulse behind those theoretical efforts, those results. In the case of tectonic theory, plate tectonics, the theory that the crust of the earth is made up of these plates that are constantly in motion on a base of molten rock, magma. And the movement of those plates on the surface is especially at their edges, which gives rise to volcanoes and earthquakes and a whole range of geological phenomena. Well, that theory of plate tectonics explains volcanoes. It explains earthquakes. It explains the shape of continents, which seem to match when you look at North and South America and Africa and Europe. It seems like you could move them together and they fit like parts of a jigsaw puzzle. Well, that's explained by a movement of these plates away from each other. The theory of plate tectonics, which only was accepted, I think, in the 1960s or so, relatively recent in the history of scientific work, scientific development, explain an enormous amount of phenomena. And so, in a sense, presents a simplified picture of how these seemingly unrelated geological phenomena do, in fact, interlace. It also has predictive power. It can explain or predict the future positions of continents as plates continue to move. Similar thing is true of evolutionary theory. I've emphasized that if you doubt Darwin's results in evolution, his theory of natural selection, of the survival of the fittest, and how that produces change in species over years, over millennia, over millions of years. It's only because you haven't read his work, The Origin of Species. It was a work that I read in junior high school, actually. I was about 12, and I read it because we had to select a book to do a book report on in English. And for some reason, I was drawn to that work, and my teacher let me read it. Well, the amount of detail, the amount of evidence, the amount of observations that Darwin brings forth to support his results that he knew would be radical and he knew would be rejected, by the religious community. He knew that he was fighting an uphill battle. Well, the amount of evidence he presents for that is overwhelming. You read that work, and again, whether or not you believe in a deity, whether you believe in divinities, you are convinced at the end of your work that God, a controlling divinity, if there is such, is operating in nature according to this theory. That's how species change and develop. And it's been said repeatedly, actually, that nothing makes sense in biology except in the light of evolution. That evolution explains everything and explains the forms of organisms, it explains their complexity, and it presents in a very simple picture that in every generation there are variations emerging. No two organisms look alike. There are genetic variations, and in certain environments, certain organisms are favored, have an advantage. They're able to survive and reproduce at a rate greater than other organisms of a similar kind. And over time, that produces the full range, the full diversity of life on Earth in all of its complexity, in all of its beauty. That is a simplification of the most diverse and complex array of phenomena that we can imagine, the phenomena of life. So, another example, right? And there's beauty in that. That's the point too. That's part of what Michelangelo was pointing to. The beauty of the distillation. It's what guided Einstein's work. It's what guided Mozart's career. That successive distillation, simplification to achieve an essential representation. The Big Bang Theory. We start from a very simple set of forms, And that manifests ultimately over time in all of the astonishing complexity of the universe. The theory itself, the picture, the notion is fundamentally simple. That's what we demand of our scientific theories. That's the impulse behind them. Simplification. The ability to account for an enormous range of phenomena, of experiences. The greater the range of experiences that can be accounted for by a theory, the more powerful, the more embraced that theory is. When I was in, there's an aphorism actually that relates to that. Science simplifies. Simplicity is predictive. It sort of summarizes what I've been saying, goes a little bit beyond that. But I want to make a point. When I was in molecular biology, I was often asked by other researchers to evaluate theories, hypotheses they had to explain certain systems, in molecular biology, how mitochondria worked, or how certain organelles, how certain parts of the cell, were likely to function in terms of their molecular biology. And what I encountered over and over again were these extraordinarily elaborate, complex representations. It was as if they had done a series of experiments and they wanted to fit everything together, but they didn't distill anything. They didn't present a simplified account or picture. They presented something that was at the same level of complexity or close to it as the data itself. The point of a scientific theory is to reduce the data to simplified forms, to relationships, to equations, E = mc squared. Well, I can't tell you the number of times I would tell the researcher, I don't think nature is operating that way. And even if nature is operating that way, we will not accept that as a final account, a final representation. We want a greater distillation of results. Now, the reason we want a greater distillation of results is because of the most fundamental aspects of our space, our world, our conceptual space, the set of all ideas, all concepts. And that is, I go back to this. Heuristic space is a space in which any two things are approximately equal. Two chairs approximately equal. An epistemic space in which two things are rigorously distinct. Within heuristic space, two things can be equated for some purpose. Two chairs are able to accomplish the same ultimate goal or function of providing us a place to sit. The nature of epistemic space, a rigorous space, entertains any difference as significant and as making a general claim about the 2 points, the two objects, not rigorously justifiable. Again, I summarize it. In a heuristic space, any two things are approximately the same for some purpose or other, rigorously distinct. And that rigorous distinction is what characterizes epistemic space. Well, epistemic space is divergent. Any two things are distinct and distinctive from each other. That's the nature of an existential space. We exist in difference, in distinction from everything else. It's the fundamental ground, the fundamental justification for claims of human dignity, the dignity of anything within the world, that it is fundamentally irreplaceable because it is fundamentally distinct and distinctive from everything else. It will be similar at some level of generality, for some purpose, for the purpose of voting, for the purpose of working in a factory, for the purpose of, doing some task, achieving some goal, approximately the same. And I've emphasized in the past that even though these seem like difficult notions, these spaces, heuristic and epistemic, there's a simple way to come to terms with them. Look around. Whatever is familiar, whatever you can name, whatever you can describe, whatever you can apply language to is heuristic. The fundamental imprint in our experience of the epistemic is, again, look around. The world is different in different directions. That distinctiveness in different directions is a mark of the presence of the epistemic in our world. Well, the logic of epistemic space is the logic of a limiting rigor. A rigor where, again, any two things are distinctive, and so whatever applies to one does not rigorously apply to the other. That includes every aspect of mortality. That includes every basis for despair. We despair because we think the future will resemble the past. Well, it may resemble it, but it's not going to be identical to it, sufficient to justify despair. Okay. The logic of heuristic space is convergence, right? We are bringing things together. We are bringing things together within certain concepts. We are clustering objects as chairs, as tables, as people, as living things, as physical objects. Our concepts are clustering, grouping things together based upon, again, similarities. Wittgenstein called it family resemblances for some purpose or other. Convergence is the controlling dynamic functionality of heuristic space. When we want to create something, we are bringing things together. When we want to achieve a goal, we are bringing things together to achieve that goal. That bringing things together might involve repetitious acts like going to a gym every day and working out and lifting weights and running, whatever we might do, repetitiously to promote our health and well-being. It might involve, in the case of a creative process, doing an experiment repeatedly, varying things, adding different ingredients, doing what Edison did to perfect the light bulb, doing what Ian Wilmot did to achieve the first successful cloning of Dolly, doing what the Wright brothers did to achieve the airplane, bringing things together. What is an artist doing? When somebody is painting, they are bringing colors together. They are bringing forms together. What is a writer doing? Sequencing words, bringing them together. Whatever the creative process is, whatever the goal we are moving towards, we are engaging in a process of convergence. That is the nature of heuristic space. That is its logic. Salvation, as religions imagine, is achieved within the rigor, the logic of epistemic space, where there's no goal to achieve. The solution is right here, right now, in the sense of, again, the recognition of our distinctiveness from everything else, our dignity from everything else, and our singularity. Right? When Kierkegaard wrote about his epitaph, what he wanted on his tombstone were only two words: the individual. That's where philosophy is positioned. That's where religions imagine mystical union with God to be achieved. Right here, right now. That's where Buddhism imagines enlightenment, the understanding of nirvana to be achieved. Right here, right now. These are complete solutions that are independent of moving somewhere else in pursuit of a goal. When we're moving somewhere else in pursuit of a goal, we are following a heuristic process to achieve that goal, and we are exercising some order of convergence, bringing elements together. When Mozart is writing a composition, he is bringing elements together. He is bringing orchestration. He is sequencing notes. That process of creation, the creation of any work of art, any intellectual work, is a convergent process. Well, what is a simplification? A simplification is bringing things. What is the theory doing? For example, when evolutionary theory explains all biological phenomena, it is effectively bringing all of those phenomena together to within a representation that's explained by, accounted for, the theory of survival of the fittest and natural selection operating upon the most favored forms in a given environment. In other words, that whole range of biological experience and diversity that's explained by the theory of evolution is representable as a convergent result. The same thing, E equals mc squared, a convergent result. The convergent not just in terms of it's bringing together energy and mass in a relationship, but in terms of the process by which it was achieved, in terms of the process by which it was achieved, not just in Einstein's work, but in the history of physics leading up to that point. A convergent process, an ultimate simplification of an enormous complexity of experience that is distilled, that is summarized, that is, if you like, explained. So, the reason ultimately why simplification has the role and the value that it does is it's another term for convergence within, again, the creative, convergent, linguistic, technological, scientific, social space that we move, that is the one space, type of space, heuristic space, in distinction from epistemic space, which is the space that religions seek in terms of a realization of what? A complete solution here and now, and independent of any direction of future experience. Not the goal is here, now, not outside itself. The goal in a heuristic space is outside itself, in a process ultimately of convergence, which is a process ultimately of some mode of simplification, of bringing together a multiplicity of things into a single thing. Now, we can understand the existence of individual objects in just that way. So, for example, one of the fundamental aspects of the world that I've talked about, and we'll talk about again, is this notion that we cannot leave the world to view it from the outside. We imagine we can. Our conceptual structures lead us to think that we can. Science imagines often that it's seeing the world from the outside and painting a picture of an objective world, an independently existing reality that would be here whether or not we are, right? Whether or not there's anyone to observe it. Well, okay, that's a heuristic device. The most powerful results in science, in physics, the theory of relativity, quantum mechanics, are predicated upon the understanding that we cannot leave the world to view it. We have to experience it, understand it from within. Well, what was I going to say about that? So ultimately, we are achieving a simplification based upon our heuristic orientation to experience. Oh, okay, so we cannot leave the world, see it from the outside. We cannot leave the world to achieve what's sometimes called an Archimedean point, an outside point of reference. What that means is that logically, mathematically, each individual object can be seen as representing the mapping of the world, the convergence of all of the world, of all of existence to that point. So every object, every individual, every point can be seen as a point of universal convergence. All things in the world, all things in the universe, mapping to where we are right here, right now. Wherever any one of us is, right here, right now, or at any time. A universal mapping is the result of the circumstance that we cannot leave the world to experience it from the outside. A way to summarize that is this third relationship, that the limit of the heuristic converges upon the epistemic. In other words, everything in the world can be seen as converging upon you, upon any given object, because again, that object cannot be removed. It can disappear, it can undergo changes, but we can't imagine taking it out of the world. And so we can say that every point in existence maps to any particular point. And that universal convergence, that universal mapping gives rise to the brute reality of our existence. And that brute reality, what distinguishes us from everything else is that epistemic reality, right? That we are distinctive here and now from everything else. So we can say that a universal convergence of everything at a given point creates the epistemic reality of our circumstance. Now, I know that's a little bit, it's a simplification, but, I want to give you, it's a picture, of how to see the relationship, one aspect of the relationship between heuristic and epistemic spaces. But again, it represents a simplification. We can be seen as simplifications in our existence of the entire world. Because again, we cannot leave the world to view it. In the time remaining, I wanted to deal with a few things. One of the forms that the simplifying tendency of creative work takes in my work is the aphorism, right? The aphorism is a simplified philosophical form. The past cannot guarantee the future decides the past. A great deal of philosophic elaboration, inquiry, argument, understanding is concentrated into that proposition. Now, you can say, well, that's a philosophical proposition, so how can that be a convergent result? Well, for one reason, because there is a connection between the heuristic and the epistemic, right? For another reason, whenever we're using words, we're really operating within heuristic space. Epistemic space is silent. Epistemic space is non-conceptual because there are no groupings or clusterings. So when I'm using these aphoristic representations, it's really representing in heuristic terms something of the nature of epistemic or rigorous space. Otherwise, there would be silence, okay? But so the aphorism represents that impulse towards distillation and simplification at its limit. Now, there's a there's a section of Phalaris's Bull where I talk about my turning to the writing of aphorisms in my first philosophical work. The first work I wrote was called Considerations on the Nature of Things. It kind of has a reference in the title to a work by Lucretius, a Roman philosopher. But the book started not in aphoristic form. It started in paragraph form. But very quickly, within the first 10 pages, I was writing aphorisms. And from that time forward, that became my major mode of philosophical expression, that concentration and distillation and simplification into a formulation of 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 words. Something extremely concentrated. For me, elegant. There's a beauty for me in the aphorisms. Well, I wrote an account of that process and of something about the appeal of the aphorism in Phalaris's Bull. And it goes like, and I wrote, first paragraphs, but within 10 pages, aphorisms, concentrated statements, verbal mathematics. The riddle of the world is an object. God is a skeptic, generating time. The style of Heraclitus and Pascal, Nietzsche and Wittgenstein, powerful, lean, intemperate, uncompromising, concentrated, urgent, definitive. A style for a moment of death, when everything must be concentrated into a few redemptive words, because there is no time, as there never is at the moment of philosophy. Because the moment of philosophy has to be that moment that deals with the extremities of the human condition. And I've given accounts of how during the earthquake in 1994, I ran an aphorism through my mind, selflessness, how one acts not out of need, that had always addressed the most extreme circumstances and allayed whatever pain or anxiety was associated with those circumstances. But it didn't work at the moment of death when my apartment was collapsing around me and it looked like I was about to die. So I ran another more fundamental aphorism. The meaning of the world is its most general representation, which gives the nature of perspective that was at the time at the foundation of my philosophical writing, of my aphoristic writing, and that did work. That did have the power to cut through the fear and the anxiety and the agony of that moment of impending death. I didn't die, obviously, but I was told later that had a supporting structure of the building I was in shifted another couple of millimeters, it would have collapsed, and I would have. And I didn't know at the time that that wasn't going to be my fate. So, but the point is, the philosophy stood up. The aphoristic formulation stood up. And that's what we want, that degree of concentration that, well, we aspire to, in, again, every form of art. Something so concentrated, so distilled that it's powerful and sufficient even to the greatest extremities of our experience, even to a moment of death, even to a moment of torture to death. There's something I wrote at the beginning of my early website that gives an illustration of the process of simplification that my philosophical writing aspires to, that aphoristic writing is aspiring to. The title of the paragraph is Eden, 2 not equal to 1. And I just want to show you, I did skywriting of that over Los Angeles, about 20 years ago. The skywriting looks like that, Eden, 2 not equal to 1. And just to show you again something about the centrality of the impulse to simplification and distillation, in philosophical work. Let me read you. Let me pull this up a second. This short paragraph that again is meant to be a complete account, a complete summary, of our circumstances and of what responds to them. Eden, 2 not equal to 1. The solution to the problem of human suffering is existence. That 2 points in any conceptual space, 2 objects with identical properties are distinguishable. Epistemic. Because of which we cannot perfectly control an experiment and cannot validate a conclusion, not rigorously, except in the oversimplifications of our mind. And so science is aesthetics and heuristics, not rigorous. Its logic, a theoretical impossibility. We cannot do a perfectly controlled experiment in this world, different in different directions. Theoretically impossible. We can do controlled experiments mentally, not physically. So as to say, we suffer, not existentially, but in thought. The point of individuation, of individual existence, is salvation. A distillation, a summary. But it's taken me decades to reach that. It takes any artist, any intellectual, any thinker, any scientist, endless effort to achieve a distillation of results, a simplification of results. We see the evidence of that type of simplification in the concluding lines of works. I mentioned that Handel's compositions, Handel's operas, Philip Glass's compositions often culminate in a movement that is the distillation of what's come before in the piece and their greatest achievements. Well, that's a goal that writing aspires to. My I think favorite example of this is by Henry David Thoreau in his Walden. Its final line: "The sun is but a morning star." It summarizes really the impulse within the work. The past can't guarantee the future. The future decides the past. I mean, that's my sort of aphoristic formulation of my work, but you can think of my work as explaining Thoreau's or Thoreau's work explaining mine. The point is they connect. And that final line, "the sun is but a morning star," is a distillation of the impulses of the hundreds of pages of Walden, of the experiences that went into it, of the reflection, of all of the effort. It comes down to those words, that final line that is enough to live by. Again, that's the achievement of distillation in thought, in art, in philosophy. And finally, I wanted to just read a work. It's an aphoristic work of mine. Again, when I read these works, of which there are a few hundred, they're not easy to understand, right? When you hear them, because they're not just philosophy concentrated into aphoristic form, but it's given a poetic formulation as well. And so it's even more concentrated. But the sound helps, I think, convey some of the meaning. Aside from that, the ideas that are expressed are the ideas that we've been discussing. So the ideas as represented in some of these aphoristic writings can become a token, of the discussions, of the talks, and having listened to the talk, a line or two from one of these concentrated works can be embraced as a summary that one can go back to because it contains, in, again, distilled, concentrated, ultimately simplified form, what an hour and a half of discussion may convey or hope to convey. Well, let me read this, and then I'll address the questions from last time, which I think was a month ago, but still. Okay. Here it's called Simple Seas. And again, you listen more for the sound of it, but you'll hear the basic ideas. Of tendencies of mind, precision alone effects salvation. Salvations as worlds are pointwise arrays. Only asymmetries, epistemics, exist. Dignities demand finite worlds. Science sees the world from a distance. That's where it sees patterns from a distance. Close up, we're in quantum mechanical reality, where everything is strange and beautiful and new. We exist as non-superimposable points, distinctive points. Limit divergence supports limit convergence biconditionally. That's part of the heuristic converges to the epistemic. Non-existence is an endless cubic lattice. It's a mathematical representation. A singular asymmetry conceives all possible worlds. We'll talk about that in a future talk. Existence is a dignity of difference, distinctiveness. We exist and achieve our dignity in our distinctiveness. Each point is as singular as God. All of existence projects to each point. That's what I was saying earlier. The heuristic converges onto the epistemic, where we are, here and now. We exist at the limit of dignity. We float in simple seas. Any difference creates every world. Okay, so that concludes our talk on the philosophy of simplicity. I know some of it is not maybe so easy, but still you see the impulse towards a distillation, a simplification of thought and expression. Okay, now I have some questions from last time. Let me address them. We have a few minutes, so I have time to do that. And I have them here. So, first, how important is know thyself during the pandemic? Okay. Well, first of all, one of the things I've talked about know thyself before as like, there's a simplification, right? The Delphic Oracle's advice to everybody, know thyself. That's a distillation of wisdom, right? Same impulse that we've been talking about, in every example, right, that I've been elaborating. Well, the most important aspect of knowing thyself, though, is that one can't, independently of future experience. In fact, I have an aphorism to the effect, know thyself, as if one could, independently of all future experience. In other words, we judge ourselves and we limit ourselves to our peril. And in the course of the pandemic, where we're confined, where we're in circumstances that are unfamiliar to us, maybe uncomfortable, unfriendly to us, we have to be open to the possibility that even those circumstances we can embrace. Even those circumstances we can exploit for some benefit to ourselves, to others, ultimately. So the important thing about knowing thyself is to know that one can't quite assess limitation. That, I was emphasizing in the past that science at the end of the 19th century had proven the impossibility of the airplane, okay? Couldn't exist, it violated fundamental laws of physics. Those scientists, those physicists writing those papers and publishing in major physics journals at the end of the 19th century were wrong, as subsequent experience demonstrated. The people that looked at Van Gogh's early work and said, he has no talent, were wrong, okay? He himself was probably aware of the fact that he wasn't exhibiting, artistic talent early on, but he worked and persevered and became the most popular great painter in history in 10 years. So again, let's not ever prejudge ourselves. That's the most important aspect to self-knowledge, that so far as we can ever say we are greater in principle than our imaginings. Let experience prove us wrong. Okay? Now, the other question, what is the relationship between heuristic dimensions of social life and society today? Okay. Remember, when we're talking about heuristics, we're talking about convergent structures, things that come together. One prominent aspect of contemporary life, it's been an aspect of society for several centuries now, has been a convergent process of cultural homogenation, right? Where you go different parts of the world and there are McDonald's. You go wherever and people are dressed much the same because of the influence of Western culture, because of the influence of Western films, American films. There's a universalization of language in the degree to which English is an international language at the moment, partly because of political factors, the prominence of Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, the British Empire, the prominence of America, in the 20th century. So English becomes a universal language. That is a mode of convergence, right? People going online and sharing experience. The Zuckerberg goal of bringing everyone together on Facebook, on that social media platform, what does that represent? That bringing together is a convergent process. That's a heuristic process. But at the same time, you see people asserting individuality, asserting national identity, individual identities. So these things, when we are asserting the individual, when we are asserting the distinctive, we are representing, occupying, embracing the epistemic. Right? When we are asserting, embracing social media, when we embracing cultural patterns that bind us together globally, well, that's a heuristic process. There's a tension, right? Each has its place. Salvation, as religions imagined, is achieved rigorously through the logic of the epistemic. But goals are achieved heuristically in convergent space. Okay, I think that might be what we have time for. Okay, well, I hope this was an enjoyable talk. And are there questions?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much, Stephen, for such an amazing talk today. And we have had a huge break, but we're back. So please make sure to join us weekly next time. And Stephen will definitely address all your questions in the end. And we do have a lot of questions. And thank you very much again for your feedback, for your likes, your emojis. We see them all, and we really appreciate them all. And concerning the questions, welcome, Daniel. Welcome back. Hello to you. He says hello.
Hello, Danielle.
And one of the questions is, yes, the most important thing to learn is English. In English to read is Shakespeare, but what about Jack London and A.C. Doyle, also great writers?
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes, I will talk about that next time. Yes.
The next one is, have you ever seen a movie about Mozart called Amadei? And what
Yes.
do you think about his relationship with Salieri according to this movie?
I will talk about that next time too. Yes.
And also sense between Salieri and Mozart's wife, whereas the meaning, in my opinion, art is more previous than human instincts. And what about your opinion, Stephen?
Okay.
And yes, evidence, the most important thing to support something or explain your thesis, please. But what do you think that some people in organizations in our modern world sense evidence out of sight or out of board, actually in politic or economic? And the comment, thanks for the lecture. It was interesting. Thank you for joining. And one more time, big thanks, big thumbs up to Stephen Friedman, our amazing speaker. We're really glad to be back. And thank you, friends, for all your feedback and all your questions. We will definitely address them next week. Make sure to join. Please stay safe. Have a great week. And we hope to see you all next week. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Aaliyah. And yes, I look forward to next week. Thank you all so much.